we're looking at this economic situation that's occurring within our community, and we're looking at the recent economic numbers that came down in April, showing that unemployment has surged within the black community, whatever. What do you think are some of the things that we're going to need to start doing, besides looking to place blame on President Obama, or what else should we be doing in our communities?
Well, I do think even if we make the commitment to not blame President Obama for everything, we still have to look at the political landscape and say, what can we as a community do to shift the political tide? Because the reality is, as long as there's an absence of race-targeted policy, there's going to be an absence of racial progress. And so that doesn't mean that we should wait for Barack Obama to come down from on high and just give black people big bags of money. But what it does mean is that African-American people in the African-American community have to begin advocating and demanding more from local and state and national legislators, so that job policies and job opportunities open up on a wide scale. That means that we as a community have to become organized. Unemployment will remain high as long as we're not organized.
When we look at this, Lorie, we look at the $800 billion stimulus package that they have out there, right? And we look at the number of jobs that were created, and we look at the corporations that got the money. 83% of the people that got those contracts through that funding were white companies. Only 21% was broken down between blacks, Latinos, and Asians. And so when we're looking at those type of numbers, how are we talking about this particular stimulus package, which the President Lord's really making any difference in our community, because it's negligible based on what we just talked about?
Well, that's why I think what Mark said is very important. We have to organize and have our voice be heard, because during better economic times, we weren't getting contracts and things of that nature. So now, it's even more difficult. And although there are other options that I think you're going to talk about later on in terms of getting funding for starting up businesses, those are few and far between, and they're really a very small percentage of what can actually be distributed to the community. So we really have to organize, similar to what was done today here in New York with the rally downtown in Manhattan, in the Wall Street area, where everybody who is being affected, meaning the little guy, is organizing and making it known that they're not going to sit back and let this happen.
So what it sounds like to me is like we have to get back to this whole thing that Dr. King talked about with the Poor People's March, right?
That's right.
Where we cross racial lines. We're attracting people based on principles and based on the effects of what's been happening in this economy. Now, that there's race issues and there's class issues. Do we think or do you think that's something that can actually work?
When you use the term cross racial lines, you have to do that you have to be take a closer look at what that means.
Okay.
Because when the community service society 2 years ago or 3 years ago did a study and found that 48% of blacks in New York were unemployed. That was a shocker. So the stimulus may add an extra hamburger on the plate, but is that really enough dealing with within the racial lines the problems that are affecting us? How are we going to organize and be at the table to deal with decision making that really makes substantive change? That's what we have to look at.
Well, let's be realistic about the political atmosphere that's out here. Race-targeted policies are radioactive, wouldn't you say, Mark? So if President Obama tried to do something like that, do you think he would win re-election? You think the Republicans would attack him immediately on something like that?
Yeah, strategically, you can't always... Barack Obama's in a very unique position because he cannot say our names, right? Because he's marketed himself as a race-neutral president, someone who happens to be black rather than a black president. And as such, he can't talk about race in explicit ways, and he can't bring about race-targeted policies in a very explicit way, because what they do is they then racialize him and then spark a certain kind of response from his opponents, which would kill any kind of bill and lower public opinion, because the more black Obama becomes, the less popular he becomes. But what we could do is think about bills, for example, that have overwhelming impact on African-American people. And to some extent, Barack Obama has done that with certain civil rights legislation, certain housing legislation, even domestic HIV/AIDS stuff. But when it comes to jobs, we still haven't seen policy that accounts for the particular ways that black people are disadvantaged on the labor market, the particular way that black people are disadvantaged in collective bargaining and so forth and so on. And so to that extent, we need to have that targeted policy, but it's not going to come from a president who does it out of feeling. It's going to come from a people who do it out of interest.
It has to come from somewhere.
Exactly, and that somewhere is us.
Well, Lorie, for example, nearly a quarter of our nation's black laborers work for state agencies or state governments or whatever. And you talked about last week how a lot of these state governments are in the red. And you also mentioned that stimulus funding is drying up. So now that you have a quarter of people that are black laborers working for these state governments, with stimulus money drying up, what does that mean? That means
they're going to be targeted, and it's especially important because we've had an example of this even before the big collapse of the economy with the MTA here in New York. Mm-hmm. You know, when the older people were saying, you know, the veterans were saying, we don't want the young people coming in to lose their pensions, lose their health benefits. So we're going to, you know, band together and collectively, you know, try and make a difference. And you saw what happened to them. They were fined until they had to just stop for, you know, the good of the public good situation. But we now have unions being attacked all over. So they're all looking at ways to make sure that the little guy suffers more. Meanwhile, these corporations continue to get subsidies and tax breaks and all these other things that benefit them and only them.
Well, I was thinking about the unemployment numbers, Bert, and I just want to kind of run off some of them based off of a study that was done. And they was looking at unemployment numbers before this recession started. In 2006, for example, in Birmingham, Alabama, I think the unemployment numbers was like 5.3%. And once the recession started, it jumped to 14.5%. In Miami, it was 6.7%. It jumped to 17.2%. Los Angeles, it was 8.6%. It jumped to 19.3%. And in Detroit, it was 8%, and I think it jumped to 25.7%. That is like Depression-era unemployment. Mm-hmm. I mean, if we can't get any help on issues like this, what are we supposed to do?
Mm-hmm. There's another element in that recoveries traditionally have left blacks behind in how quickly they recover to their behind levels, even because those levels are even behind what the whites were prior to the economic problem. The recovery has shown that time after time we're still way behind when everyone else is behind.
Well, black people are saying what recovery?
Yeah, that's it.
Because based off of these numbers, they
question
hasn't been
recovery. What is it? Yeah, that's an important issue. So that's why we need the president can't completely run away. I know sometimes we get caught into something that the latest political fad of what you should do, should not do. But no president really runs away completely from ethnic issues. The presidents, even Bush, dealt with issues that with HIV. I mean, he was pretty good with that, with HIV program that affects mainly blacks now. But the presidents have traditionally dealt with issues that target or affect particular ethnic groups. And the president, he can do a little better, I think, in coming forward with because you may be there another 4 years after this election.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. I want to talk about a particular issue that I think is interesting because, and I want to bring you back in the conversation, Mark. One of the pieces that we were discussing in the show was dealing with the issue of discrimination. We know that the Federal Housing Administration for generations discriminated against blacks. And now we have black communities now that are getting involved in suing some of these banks that have, like the Bank of America, I think is one of them, and Wells Fargo is another one that's involved in reverse redlining and stuff. And the thing that I find interesting about that, the administration seems to be silent on this issue. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think that there's a few issues here. One, that it's important that at this moment in history we actually highlight the way in which residential segregation continues to happen and the way in which, in fact, forms of segregation and now in many ways are more intense demographically than they were 30, 40, 50 years ago. In some ways, we've returned to the pre-1964, 1965.
So we're going backwards then?
Urban conflict. Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at residential segregation, if you look at school segregation or desegregation numbers, we're pretty much back in the 60s again. So, and people say, well, there might be some benefit to that. But the thing you have to remember is black folk didn't integrate or at least desegregate because we thought our IQs would go up if white people are in the room, or we thought our houses would feel more comfortable if white people live next door. We knew that if white kids were in school with us, we would have books in the room. We'd have teachers in the room. We'd have a school there. That's what Brown versus Board was about. We understood that if white people were in our neighborhoods, we'd have resources. And there's nothing wrong with having all black neighborhoods. It's not that. That is a proxy for something far more problematic in urban centers when it's just black people there, because black people are rendered disposable. And the issue then, when you link it to the banks, when you link it to the mortgage lenders, when you link it to these broader state institutions, is that they have conspired to construct particular configurations of neighborhoods so that resources go one place, black folk go another place. Police protection goes one place, Negroes go another place. So everywhere where all the prosperity is, black folks ain't there. Everything where the misery is, black folks are right in the center of it. And we see banks doing that and doing it for their own financial interest. So it's really important that we sue them, that we challenge them, that we put a spotlight on this, because none of this can happen if we don't have the complicity of these non-governmental organizations, but also the government itself.
But we have the Justice Department that has been expanded now. We know that President Obama has invested all of this money in going after the things that President Bush didn't think was important. But in this particular issue, he's been kind of silent on it. And we're seeing black communities being devastated along that line. I would think that this would be an issue he would be speaking out on.
See, you would hope he would, and you would think he could do that in a way that wouldn't even force him into a kind of racially provocative posture. But again, the Obama administration has made several moves that just are stunning in their inattentiveness to issues of racial disparity and racial inequality. The Justice Department has failed to target all sorts of civil rights violations, hate crime. It has failed to prosecute hate crimes. This is one of several things that the Obama administration has failed to do. Now, President Obama's done a great job on lots of domestic issues, but these key racial issues have not been targeted, and I think a lot of it has to do with fear. An optimist would say, well, after he gets reelected in 2012, he can go in and really handle business. A cynic or even a critic like myself merely would simply say, nah, I think this is who he is. He's somebody who gestures to the left, plays to the middle, and ultimately satisfies the right.
Yeah, well, that's why I think it's important for us to have organizations like the Congressional Black Caucus and other organizations that are supposed to be looking at equity amongst people, compiling information so that there is proof. Because I mean, the whole reverse redlining situation is going to be very hard to prove, even though you can look at the statistics and see that it's kind of obvious what's gone on in our community. But in particular examples where individuals are able to prove that they were qualified for more conventional mortgages and were steered towards these negative mortgages, that's where you're going to get the hardcore facts that will have to be addressed by all levels going on up to the president.
Now, the thing is interesting about this, and this is not unique to the article we talked about with Baltimore, because we talked about with Chuck Schumer in New York City did a study in Queens where he looked at whites and blacks that had the same income, and they looked at the particular banks and loans that they received versus fixed rates versus variable rates or whatever. And most blacks with the same income and better credit, whatever, was steered toward those Wall Street predatory lenders or whatever, and rates that they were getting. And then we look at the idea of all the foreclosures that are going on in the system. That speaks to some type of systematic issue. Okay, that speaks to someone looking at something. There's no mistakes by these banks, Bert, because you know that they think they're looking 30 years down the road. They know exactly what they're doing in terms and how the effect is going to be on those communities.
The problem, there's a problem here that we have to face. Obama has been here for a couple of years, and we have an agency called HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Administration, that should have been on the case early, because this is nothing new about the redlining and the devastating effect that the bank lending policies and all up to the foreclosure policies and ratios that afflict us. Those come after the fact. After the fact, then we come. Look at what's happening to us. There should have been monitoring from the very beginning, because we know these conditions exist. They've been going on for decades.